Ava Martin rolled over in bed when her phone lit up at exactly 6:30 in the morning. Then she hesitated. Because the last time she stood in that ballroom, surrounded by 204 elegantly dressed strangers, her own sister's palm had silenced her, leaving a sting that never truly faded. Yet the deepest wound wasn't the slap. It was the cold eyes of her family who watched without speaking. It was the years of quiet invisibility that followed. But what if one voice broke that silence? What if the most powerful man in the room, the billionaire she'd saved without expecting gratitude, stood and said, "Today Ava Martin isn't invisible, she's why I'm alive." This isn't just Ava's story. It's a reminder that sometimes our greatest strength comes not from shouting but from the courage to break silence. The email notification glowed on the screen sender, marked only as household manager Charlotte Estate. She tapped it almost out of habit and froze. The subject line read, "Bride and Groom Anniversary Celebration 35th Year." No other text. Nothing personalized. She stared at it for a cramped minute and her thumb hovered over the delete button. Then she hesitated. Because 5 years ago she had walked away from everything. Charlotte left family dinners where her voice was never taken seriously. She had escaped to Seattle, hoping to reinvent herself, build a life separate from the suffocating weight of her parents and Delilah, her older sister. But the memory of that final night at home still burrowed in her chest. That night Delilah had laughed in front of family and friends, told her she was so predictable and desperate for attention that she'd cry on cue if anyone asked her opinion. Ava remembered the sting of the words and the way she pushed her glass of iced tea across the polished table as if it burned her fingertips. She remembered freezing, then gathering herself and walking out pretending composure. She remembered that being the moment she decided silence might be safer than speaking. And now here was the invitation. Unsentimental and dutiful, delivered through a third party, as if her presence was inconvenient but required for appearances. She flipped over and pulled the thin sheets tighter, her heart pounding. Seattle had been kind. It had given her anonymity and freedom. She had landed a marketing role at a small agency, eventually laid off when budgets were slashed, and since then she'd floundered in freelance gigs. The charred remains of that career still felt like failure, but it had also given her strength, a quiet strength she didn't know she possessed. She got out of bed and paced the studio apartment. Her plants leaned toward the window, the coffee table cluttered with half-open notebooks full of ideas she never pitched. She made a cup of chamomile tea, inhaled the steam, and tried to steady her breathing. The email sat on her phone screen. She thought of deleting it, of continuing her quiet life invisible. But then she felt something unfamiliar twist in her gut, like a bruise that was ready to bloom. Charlotte remained the place where she had grown up, where her voice had felt smaller with every glance. She sat at the small dining table and opened her laptop, the email lingering in her inbox. She typed but erased. Typed again. She thought of the anniversary celebration, a white and gold soiree with 200 guests, cameras, speeches, praising a picture-perfect marriage and perfect daughter Delilah. Ava had never been part of that picture. She thought of her mother Judith, a woman who once believed Ava was intelligent until someone taught her how inconvenient that was. She thought of her father Robert, whose eyes flickered with disappointment every time Ava dared to disagree. She thought of all those silent dinners where Delilah's laughter commanded attention and her comment went unnoticed. Now the invitation felt like a challenge. Not to heal but to reclaim space. She typed her name, address, RSVP yes to the assistant without further comment. She closed the email and brushed the screen. Later she rummaged through her closet. She found the dress she had kept in a garment bag all these years. She had bought it in Seattle for her birthday but never worn it. It was simple, elegant, deep green silk, knee-length, modest neckline. She lifted it gently, inhaling the scent of mothballs and memory. She unzipped it and shook it out. Then she folded it and placed it carefully into a suitcase along with her jeans, sweaters, and all she needed for a week. She paused as she lifted her phone and saw her reflection in the mirror. Her hair was slightly graying at the roots, her face lined from worry and long hours alone. She didn't look broken. She looked like someone who had learned to exist in half-light. But now a part of her awakened. She placed the suitcase by the door. She booked a flight at noon to Charlotte and paid for it with the last drying remnant of her savings. She sent a message to her landlord that she would be away a week. She packed her notebook, her charger, her journal where she had started drafting a memoir she never intended to publish. She lay back on her bed. The city noises drifted through her window. She closed her eyes and exhaled. The invitation wouldn't change the past. But it was a doorway. She didn't know what she'd find on the other side, but she needed to fight for the right to be seen, not by them, but by herself. Her phone buzzed with a boarding pass confirmation. She slid her finger off silence and picked it up. She stared at the phone, then slipped it into her pocket and walked toward the front door of the estate. The air was cooler outside, and every breath made her feel both foreign and familiar in this place. She crossed the dimly lit lawn toward the house again, uncertain whether she belonged or was merely tolerated. The valet took her bags without a word and led her inside. Wide marble columns framed the entrance, and the soft echo of chandeliers above drowned in polite laughter. She moved through the crowd like someone watching from the outside. Her mother, Judith Whitmore, greeted her with a smile so practiced that Ava sensed an apology behind it, too practiced to be genuine. There was no word of welcome. Only that frozen layer of cordiality. Judith tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear and murmured, "I'm so glad you came," her voice warm but hollow. Her eyes flicked away almost immediately, leaving Ava with the sense that she'd already moved on. Robert Whitmore, her father, stood a few feet away talking with a finance executive. He glanced at her, nodded with a quick lift of his eyebrow, and then turned back. The gesture was almost academic in its distance. Delilah appeared suddenly, greeting a small cluster of guests by the grand stairwell. She was radiant in a sapphire gown that shimmered beneath the chandeliers. Her laughter rang clear. She moved from person to person in smooth confidence, her conversations light and rehearsed. When she caught sight of Ava standing off to one side, she paused for a fragmented heartbeat before continuing on as if Ava were an exhibit rather than a sister. Guests mingled in the ornate foyer. One woman leaned over to whisper she thought Ava was on the events team. Ava let her continue believing that version. She draped her coat over her arm and stepped further inside. The foyer opened into the main hall, which was both intimidating and familiar. 200 faces looked pleasant in the candlelight, but to Ava they felt like a jury that had quietly written her off years ago. She navigated toward the corridor that led to the old family wing. Each step lifted complaints of memory. The carpet still smelled like powder and old fabric, the wallpaper the same pale damask, slightly faded. She paused before a gallery of framed portraits. There they were, family wedding photos, each one with Delilah glowing in the foreground and Ava glimpsed in the margins. In one older photo, Delilah held a trophy for Best Young Host and smiled straight ahead. Behind her, Ava looked sideways, absent. In another, a holiday gathering, Ava's face was halfway hidden by wrapping paper and a stooped posture. Her fingers hovered on one gilded frame. Behind the glass, she saw herself at 13 wearing a princess dress costume for a school play, standing at the far edge of a group photo. She remembered that night. She remembered being disappointed when nobody approached to congratulate her afterward. She remembered walking out to the cold driveway afterward and crying until her cheeks were wet and her mother found her. Judith had just sighed and told her to dry her eyes. The memory made her pause, but she moved on through the hallway and found her old bedroom. She stepped inside and was hit by the smell of cedar and lotion. The room was smaller than she had remembered. Her bed sat neatly, made unused for years. The dresser held framed accolades for Delilah, a stack of glossy magazine covers, invitations for gala events she'd hosted. There was no sign her sister had ever shared the space with someone else. Then at the edge of the wardrobe stood a lone graduation photo of Ava, snapped in cap and gown. It leaned behind an oversized picture of Delilah shaking hands with a senator. Ava pulled it out and held it up. She traced the edges of the frame until her fingers brushed the glass. She inhaled and released. No room for error anymore. She carried the photograph with her and crossed back toward the ballroom. Glass clinked and conversations flowed around curated centerpieces. Waitstaff moved through the tables with trays of champagne. She drifted toward the back where the buffet glistened under soft lighting. She poured herself a glass of water and listened to the conversations. People were praising Delilah's latest television segment. They spoke of her photo shoots, her speeches. She remained poised and smiling in every anecdote. Nobody asked if she herself wanted a drink. She sipped water and looked down at the reflection. The silhouette she saw did not belong to the ghost of the girl cut out of pictures. It belonged to a woman who had chosen to show up. Her heart thudded again when she heard someone speak her name in a conversation nearby. She glanced over and saw a woman in a cocktail dress discussing business with her husband. The woman said Ava must have been part of the event staff. Her husband nodded. Ava only smiled softly. She would let them keep thinking that version of her. Her phone buzzed lightly in her purse. She resisted checking it. She wanted to feel grounded. She folded her hands and walked toward the staircase. She paused to touch the banister, its wood polished smooth by decades of use. If she leaned back, she could see the edge of the lawn beyond the glass doors, and beyond that the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Dinner was announced. She tucked the photograph into her purse and followed the other guests into the dining area. She slid into a seat beside her father. He stiffened at her presence but did not protest. Her mother sat at the head table next to Delilah. None of them moved to include her more. She placed her napkin elegantly over her lap and sat still, breathing shallowly. The sound of toasts and applause filled the high-ceilinged room. She watched her mother stand and speak briefly about legacy and family pride, yet never made eye contact. Instead, she looked at Delilah with obvious admiration. Ava did not flinch. She remained poised in her seat. Thoughts engineered themselves, words she would say, questions she would ask, all turned down in favor of quiet calculation. She watched as Delilah returned to her seat, smiling politely and receiving nods and soft applause. The attention never shifted to her. At some point, her father raised his glass and said a simple thank you. The meal concluded with polite applause. Ava excused herself politely and stood. She said softly, "Thank you," and left the table. No one chased after her. She moved across the vast hallway, stepping quietly through the glow of chandelier light to the carriage house where she had rented a room. She carried the dress in one hand, the photograph in the other. When the door closed behind her, she leaned against it, exhaling slowly. The house behind her remained bright. It looked perfect, except for her. She paused in the dark entry hall, steadying herself for what had just begun. Laughter echoed through the high-ceilinged hall as I emerged onto the marble floors once again. A low hum of conversation and clinking glasses filled the air, punctuated by distant laughter. The dining room chatter drifted into the foyer, pulling me forward like an unseen current. I drew a steady breath and walked back toward the crowd, clutching the small dress and photograph at my side. The room buzzed with people, socialites, journalists, influencers, friends of Delilah. I spotted director Dylan Gray across the room talking to a cluster of guests near a champagne tower. He turned at that moment and caught my eye. I hesitated a moment, then walked over. He offered a warm smile and extended his hand. I introduced myself. He said he had admired my social media posts about travel campaigns and marketing work in Seattle. His tone was polite but genuine. We talked briefly about trends, local activism, and changing platforms. I felt him listening. I smiled. Across the room, Delilah paused mid-laugh and watched us. The color drained from her face. She cut her conversation short and strode toward us. She stepped into view and caught Dylan's attention. Without looking at me, she said, "I'm sorry to interrupt, but this is my event." She turned her attention to him and whispered something I could not hear. Dylan nodded awkwardly. Delilah's eyes flicked toward me, and she sneered. "You always make everything about you, haven't you?" Her voice carried across the polished floor. I stood still. Guests paused. Candles flickered in the tall centerpieces. Her voice dropped, and she slapped me open-handed across the cheek with enough force to bruise ego and skin alike. Silence shattered. Someone gasped. But no one moved. I stared at Delilah's face, calm but cold, as if the act completed something she believed overdue. My fingers touched my cheek and came away damp. The noise of chatter lulled into muted disbelief. I stepped back and backed away from the table, flattening the dress bag against my thigh. Tears burned, but I kept them held. I opened my mouth to speak, to say, "You don't get to treat me like this in front of other people," but no words came. My mind blacked out briefly from shock, then filled with a tight focus. No one intervened to stop it. It was as if everyone had rehearsed ignoring me. I looked up, and the chandelier's light fractured off crystal. Silence pressed so hard I felt it against my skin. I tasted copper in my mouth, focused on the scent of polished floors and sweet perfumes. I folded my arms and listened to the sharp hush. Then Alexander Kane rose from his seat. I froze. He carried a glass of champagne in one hand and a microphone in the other. His suit was crisp. His movements calm. He cleared his throat as attention turned to him. The clinking of glass abruptly ended. He spoke slowly. "Ava Martin saved my life last winter after a terrible car accident in Seattle. I was in the ravine and don't know how long I would have survived without her help." He placed the mic down and looked around the room. He said, "I cannot accept that no one stepped in and allowed that to happen." He said, "I choose to stand by the person who chose kindness over indifference in that moment." My breath caught. I stared at him. He gestured toward me. Silence cracked and murmurs rose around the room. My mother's face paled. My father sat frozen, eyes wide. For the first time, I felt his gaze on me. He looked ashamed. Someone moved to stand up, but Alexander spoke again, saying, "We are not here to celebrate shame, but to acknowledge truth and to decide who we will stand beside when life demands it." Nothing in the room felt real, except his words and the swelling beat in my chest. I stood still, feeling the dress bag drop from my arm, landing softly at my feet. I watched as people shifted uncomfortably, some swallowed. Delilah's expression hardened. Alexander took a step toward me and offered his jacket. He said, "You might need this." My body trembled. I accepted. I felt the suit fabric settle over my shoulders. My own dress felt insubstantial next to it. He said quietly, "You are seen." I held his gaze and nodded once. The hum of conversation returned slowly. A server offered me water. I took it, breathing steadily, tasting cool clarity. Guests resumed chatter, but no one dared look me directly in the eye anymore. Delilah turned away, pressed lips tight. My father shifted in his seat and touched his collar. My mother stared at her hands. Alexander sat beside me, now calm and present. I looked out of one of the tall windows at the dark lawn beyond, lit by soft lanterns. I thought back to 5 years ago when I left home, imagining nobody would notice. Now everyone saw me. Not as Delilah's shadow, but in my own light. I sipped water and breathed again. I steadied myself for whatever came next. Alexander led me through a quiet corridor toward a side entrance. Morning light filtered through stained glass, painting the marble in muted colors. I felt every eye on us as we left the main house and stepped into a small garden courtyard. A table with 2 steaming cups of coffee waited beneath a wrought iron gazebo. He removed his jacket and draped it over the back of a chair before sitting. His expression was calm and deliberate. He lifted his cup, sighed softly, then said, "Ava, urgent phone call last winter. Sunny Hill Road, Seattle. You were the only one who stopped your car in sub-zero rain without hesitation. You pulled me from my vehicle when no one else dared approach. My car teetering on the edge of a ravine. I was bleeding, unconscious, freezing, unaware of who you were. My fingers curled around the coffee cup, heat grounding me. Sparks of memory returned, headlights in the fog, a mangled car, and my own hands shaking as I called 911 and stayed beside the added irony that my voice had been quiet then, invisible, but had saved a life." He spoke again. "You didn't know me then, you just did what was right. There was no audience, no recognition." He paused. "I know how it feels to be erased, to be overlooked, and I choose to offer you a chance not to repay a debt but to reclaim a story stolen from you. Ava, you have a voice they tried to silence, and I want to help you use it if you choose." I felt the offer settle between us like a decision brought up from deep memory. I looked down at the table and shook my head. "No, the last thing I want is charity or spectacle." I said softly, "Please, just leave me alone." Alexander nodded slowly. He said that is a fair request. He said let me leave this with you. Truly give it. All thought no pressure, you know where to find me. He stood and handed me his card, heavy engraved with no number, just name and email. I folded it and placed it inside my coat pocket. I stood slowly and nodded. I wrapped the jacket around my shoulders because it felt solid warm like a shield. I thanked him and followed him back to the main house without another word. We passed through the foyer and I returned to the ballroom where velvet drapes blurred the morning sun into golden haze. By noon my phone was buzzing. The video of Delilah slapping me was everywhere. I watched my face flash across clips edited for outrage with bold captions she blew up across social feeds. Comments ranged from sympathy to mockery, many from people I'd once called friend. They said, "You really are pathetic, even your parents must be embarrassed." They said, "Maybe Seattle broke you," they laughed. My chest tightened. The coat Alexander lent me felt heavier than before. I stepped outside under a portico and swallowed fresh air between shallow breaths. I thought about what he offered. It wasn't pity, it was purpose. It wasn't money, it was momentum. I checked messages from people I'd avoided long ago, classmates from college, colleagues from agencies, invitations from events I'd declined, polite families, threads in group chats, everyone weighing in. The words stung, but they entered me less fiercely now because years of quiet had taught me resilience. And something inside me shifted, something I had long denied springing to life like a seed cracking its shell. I slipped my phone into my pocket and walked back inside. I found a seat in the far corner of the hall near one of the large windows that overlooked the lawn and trees. I watched guests arrive, afternoon tea and soft music under crystal chandeliers. I opened my coat pocket and retrieved the card Alexander had given me, name elegantly typed, email engraved. I slipped it onto the table beside my glass of water and let my fingers rest on it. I thought about saying yes for the right reason, not to hurt Delilah, but to speak truth, to be more than a silent shadow. To speak with purpose, not to provoke, but to be heard. I exhaled slowly and nodded to myself. I pushed the card into my purse and stood. I smoothed the fabric of my dress and walked toward the door leading back to the family wing. I paused halfway, touched the door frame, a faint memory of childhood playing in my mind, and smiled for the first time since I had arrived. I lifted my head and walked forward, determined to begin. I walked until I found a quiet sitting room just off the courtyard where Alexander had suggested I go. A few minutes later, a woman entered, sharply dressed in a gray pantsuit, her presence calm but deliberate. She introduced herself as Grace Harland. At the same moment, a second man followed, tall, lean, mid-30s with a notebook in hand. He said he was Eric Mallory, a private investigator. They shook hands with me without formality, as if this meeting had been inevitable. Grace offered me coffee and asked me to explain in my own words why I had returned. I spoke slowly about invisibility, about being erased from photos, and conversations about how Delilah thrived in public while I was minimized. Grace listened. She nodded. She said she specialized in protecting reputations, not destroying them. Eric smiled and said he tracked public praise and financial trails. Alexander had provided full support, he added, and they could begin exposure work as soon as I wanted. We moved to a side table stained by morning light where Grace spread a laptop and files. She opened a folder labeled The Morning Bloom. In bold letters, it read 2018 launch and copyright documents. She explained it was the show that made Delilah a household name across morning television. I leaned forward and stared at spreadsheets, social media metrics, and sponsorship agreements. Grace pointed out suspicious similarities between syndicated segments of that show and content someone had pitched years before to smaller Seattle stations. Eric tapped in a case number on his phone. He said he had started tracking posts from people who had worked under Delilah, former writers, producers, some who had left suddenly with complaints about stolen ideas or zero credit. "Ava, that is where we begin," he said. "We collect interviews, we trace ownership. We follow the money." They had access to resources that meant I could investigate without fear of being left exposed. Alexander's name appeared over my shoulder once when Grace mentioned initial funding had come from a private account. She said that meant confidentiality and speed. No bureaucracy. I stared at the open screen, the numbers and bylines of articles that mentioned Delilah. 15 former colleagues who had filed internal complaints. 4 companies that had quietly withdrawn sponsorship. 2 registered shell nonprofits under her name. Alexander had not offered vengeance. He offered structure. He offered infrastructure. I exhaled. The purpose I feared I had lost was beginning to take shape. Grace asked if I wanted to record witness statements or release public allegations. I said, let us first verify everything. I still did not want headlines. I wanted accuracy. Eric transferred voice memos from several witnesses into encrypted files and told me there would be legal reviews before any release. Grace created a workspace for me where I could review documents. I sat on a leather couch scrolling through old contracts and calendar logs. I made notes, dates, discrepancies, names omitted. I bookmarked reference threads in emails and flagged so-called charity events sponsored by Blooming Hearts Foundation. Later, I stepped outside into the garden. Sunlight warmed my coat. I walked slowly among clipped hedges, remembering how invisible I used to feel here. Now I felt something different, a sense of movement. I returned inside to find Grace, uploading documents into a shared drive labeled Campaign Truth Restoration. Eric was on the phone verifying an address for a potential whistleblower. I approached and saw Alexander standing near the foyer talking quietly with the estate's butler. He looked over at me and offered a small nod of encouragement. I nodded back, feeling steadier than I had in years. Grace invited me to review a list of 15 individuals ready to speak with us. Eric would interview anonymously. I opened the file and saw names of former producers, on-screenwriters, station managers. Some had documented little credit. One had sent proposals later repurposed by Delilah with minimal acknowledgement. I closed my eyes briefly and tasted my own professional voice, lost but not gone. Dinner preparations began again. They said I could stay with Grace and Eric this evening and retreat to the carriage house tomorrow. Alexander had arranged that. I thanked Grace and said, let us begin in the morning. She nodded and left. Eric collected his files. Alexander walked me to the garden door and paused. He said quietly, you are no longer invisible. I stood beneath the dappled light and inhaled. The plan had begun. I pressed my hand to the jacket he had given me. It felt like a uniform. I walked away slowly but with certainty, ready for what came next and whatever reckoning lay ahead. I clutched the card in my hand as I walked across the garden path toward the carriage house. The evening breeze was cool and carried the scent of jasmine and damp earth. I breathed in and exhaled, feeling the weight of what lay ahead. I had accepted a role in something far greater than resentment. I had accepted a chance to retell truth. The next morning, I arranged to meet Grace and Eric at a cafe off the estate grounds. It was small and warmly lit, walls lined with soft wood shelves and pressed fern prints. I arrived first and sat at a corner table, smoothing the fabric of the jacket Alexander had given me. It felt grounded around my shoulders like armor for something unfamiliar. Grace arrived next, her demeanor professional and gentle at once. She set down a folder labeled Internal Pitch Archives and smiled curtly. Eric joined with his laptop and an assortment of printed logs. Without preamble, he said he had found a pattern of syndicated segments from the Morning Bloom, showing uncanny similarity to earlier pitch proposals submitted to Seattle stations in 2017. He slid a stack of notebooks across the table and pushed them toward me. Minutes later, Nathan Rhodes walked in. I recognized him instantly. His hair streaked with silver at the temples. His expression wary but not surprised. We nodded at each other as though reacquainted after a long journey. Grace introduced us, then left with Eric to take calls. I sat with him alone. Nathan folded his hands on the tabletop and exhaled, the quiet in his eyes sharp. I opened my mouth to speak but paused until he leaned back. I said I came because things weren't right the night I walked away from graduation. I said I believed I was doing the honorable thing by staying silent. I said I recognized now that silence had allowed someone else to take credit for your work and that I carried some of that guilt with me. He looked at me with steady regard. He said, I stayed out because I thought forgiveness wasn't possible, but I'm here now because what you're building might be something real. I nodded. Grace returned then and laid out a plan for verifying timeline overlap and preserving chain of custody. She made clear that any publication had to be airtight legally or risk a defamation suit. I said I understood. I needed context, not sensationalism. Nathan slid the open notebook across to me. It was dated May 2017. It detailed a show segment titled Morning Sparks that mapped nearly point for point to an episode of The Morning Bloom aired 6 months later. The host's introduction. The content categories. Even some phrasing matched. He said he pitched it with all sincerity, then was dismissed as unoriginal. He watched Delilah rise with the same idea repackaged and polished. My throat tightened. I touched the notebook cover gently. It felt like evidence and accusation at once. I said I want to give you credit publicly. He shook his head and said not now. Next step would take structure. Grace clarified we would create a statement timeline, file affidavits, hold everything in escrow until ready. We spent the next hour sorting materials. I observed Grace's precision filing each document into digital folders labeled analytics, pitch comparisons, witness statements. Eric returned with more voices who had worked on Delilah's team anonymously but left with complaints of idea theft or credit erased. Eric said some would agree to speak in person once they felt secure. I drank tea slowly and watched sunlight shift across the table. Nathan's gaze rested on me. I said thank you for trusting me. He nodded. He said I don't expect apologies. This is about recalibrating the record. Later I returned to the carriage house and unpacked the folder. I matched timestamps from Seattle broadcasting logs to the Morning Bloom's production schedules. I bookmarked email chains where proposals sat in inboxes with a subject line from Nathan. I noted the days where Delilah's show aired similar segments weeks later. I arranged everything chronologically. Outside twilight settled over the lawn. I walked to the garden path and inhaled the cool air. I replayed Nathan's words about reclaiming story. That phrase felt right. The jacket in my room hung still crisp. It had become a symbol not of alliance but purpose. I pressed my palm against it again, recalling Alexander's voice about being seen. The path ahead would be long. But I had more than memories now. I had facts. I had witnesses. And I had a story that demanded to be told. I spent the morning absorbed in the shared drive scrolling through files saved under campaign documents. A quiet certainty settled over me. It was time to give those voices room to speak. By mid-afternoon, I was walking toward the estate's media room, carrying the same jacket Alexander had lent me. Grace and a technician were already there, surrounded by laptops, notes, and coffee cups. The room was warm with purpose cables snaking across the floor, a single camera perched on a tripod under a soft light. A black background gave formality to the setup. Grace greeted me and nodded toward the microphones, motioning me into position. Eric sat nearby reviewing audio files of witness statements. The show went live in the evening, no audience, no applause, only intention. I stepped in front of the camera, looked directly into the lens, and spoke simply. Welcome to Silent Voices, a place where stories erased by the glare of someone else's fame find a quiet space to be heard. Then Nathan's testimony played. His voice was measured, factual, recounting the experience of watching ideas vanish into someone else's byline. I felt each word settle in the room, stirring memories and resolving contradictions. After it aired silently at midnight, I returned to my room, listening to the hum of syncing files and text notifications flowing in from the shared drive. The next morning, the viewer count climbed steadily, then surged. Comments appeared, some nods of support, others sharp criticisms accusing me of manipulation. A few asked for honesty, citing the same old systems that elevate stars and bury background labor. Delilah responded by midday with a refined video. She addressed the camera directly, stating that Silent Voices was a fabrication, a staged effort to reclaim attention she believed she never took. She spoke of loyalty, theatrics, and fake sympathy. Her words were rehearsed, her tone icy. The responses split. Some defended her, calling me opportunistic. Others defended the show, sharing their own stories of erasure and exploitation in the industry. I watched it all unfurl from Grace's doorway. She appeared and placed a steady hand on my arm, reminding me that silence is sometimes the sharpest arrow, that not responding lets questions bloom and criticisms fade. Later, Alexander walked in and said clarity can outlast any rebuttal, that time reveals truth, while noise fades quickly. He offered no applause, only a quiet nod. I inhaled and released the tension I'd been holding. By afternoon, messages flooded my inbox, media outlets with interview requests, blogs wanting background, talk show producers eager to feature me. I consulted Grace. She filtered them all. I declined. Now wasn't the time to be the face of anything. The campaign was bigger than me. I was a conduit, not a performer. I stepped into the courtyard and walked among the magnolia trees swaying in the breeze. The sun lowered, casting golden light across clipped hedges. I thought about the solidarity in anonymous stories, the way truth had begun to awaken beyond my solitude. The live stream was just the first spark. Grace had outlined next steps, gathering more testimonies, verifying financial trails, preparing legal frameworks. Eric would coordinate. I would continue holding space, not headlines. Back inside, I sat in a deserted foyer corner and opened the campaign folder. Eric had uploaded 8 anonymous audio files and naval logs showing sponsorships pulled quietly. Grace had added pitch comparison documents. I clicked each file carefully: notes, comparisons, proposals, statements, layers of documentation that mapped the pattern, repeated ideas, repurposed pitches. Credit vanished. The jacket draped over my shoulders felt heavier with purpose than when I first wore it. I placed a hand on the embroidered lining and reminded myself what it meant: a shield, not a mask. Responsibility, not identity. I leaned against the wall and felt steadier than I had in years. Later, guests passed by quietly. Some made eye contact, maybe recognizing the shift in me. Others barely blinked. I didn't wait for their acknowledgement. I recognized something deeper shifting in the estate's atmosphere as well. Layers of complacency and silence began to crack. I exhaled slowly as the estate's doors opened to evening light and voices drifted from gardens beyond. My phone vibrated with tagged photos and articles referencing silent voices. Streaming data marked names I had never met. But I remained still, breathing in the steadiness of purpose. Truth was growing louder than any accusation. I looked out the window at the empty lawn, the fountains still, the shadows lengthening. And I sat calm, ready for the next move. Judith asked me to meet her in the study less than a day after the video went viral. I found her seated behind the ornate mahogany desk, wearing an expression that blended composure and calculation. Her voice was soft as she spoke, warning me of consequences if I did not remove the Silent Voices live stream immediately. She reminded me that our family's reputation was at stake and hinted at the fallout I would suffer. The threat was clear: continue this public campaign, and I would be written out of the family narrative entirely. I met her gaze steadily and simply said, "I will not erase the truth." Without another word, she turned away from me. That evening, a formal letter arrived in an embossed envelope bearing the logo Abram and McNeil Law Firm. It was from Delilah's legal team. The letter asserted defamation, demanding retraction within 7 days, threatening financial and reputational damages. It cited specific sections of corporate libel law. The language was clinical and unyielding. I held it in my hand, feeling the ink charged with threat and control. I delivered the envelope to Grace the next morning. She opened it with efficient silence. She explained that Alexander had already retained one of the region's foremost defamation attorneys. He had also begun drafting a fair use motion and preemptive filings to declare the campaign a matter of public interest. Grace told me not to worry over the letter's tone or threats. We were protected legally. I nodded, swallowing relief and resolve alike. Later that day, Alexander offered me another dossier. Inside were scanned documents from 2019 internal complaints lodged by former staff accusing Delilah of idea theft. Those memos recommended investigation. Instead, station management had quietly buried the case, citing damage control. Names, dates, email exchanges, original pitch outlines were all in the files. I flipped through them, feeling pieces of the puzzle click into place. This wasn't an isolated incident. There was deliberate erasure, pattern after pattern. As dusk fell, I saw Robert for the first time since the campaign began. He passed my room without greeting, eyes fixed forward. In that silence, I realized that neutrality from him was complicity. I understood then that silence from family had helped perpetuate this. I would no longer blend into the background. I returned to the media room and opened the folder labeled Family Opposition. Grace was drafting our second public release, a statement exposing the suppressed 2019 allegations and linking them to the current campaign. She included legal footnotes and cited documentation. Eric had already gathered financial records. I saw contracts with nonprofits, sponsorship agreements, and unexplained payments tied to Delilah's foundation. He had cross-referenced staff members who filed internal complaints and was preparing sanitized interviews with them. Later, Delilah appeared on a local televised charity panel. She spoke about rebranding efforts and community engagement with effortless charm. A host asked about recent politics. She deflected smoothly. There was no acknowledgement of scandal. Her public facade was polished beyond question. I watched her framed on screen and felt the calm before inevitable cracks. Grace leaned over and whispered, "This is precisely where we challenge the narrative. The version of Delilah that the public sees must align with the one the record reflects." I watched her confidence as she scheduled the statement release, the whistleblower statement securing anonymity. She clicked send softly, her courage steady. After dinner, I walked out to the courtyard. The magnolia's white petals hovered in moonlight. I traced footprints by the fountain's edge, recalling childhood times when I used to slip out here to avoid attention. Tonight, I was unmoved by invisibility. I inhaled deeply, the night air tasting of jasmine and determination. The stakes were clear. Silence would let the pattern continue. I would not let that happen. Returning to the carriage house, I paused by the mirror and adjusted the jacket Alexander lent. It felt heavier now, with intention, less like borrowed armor and more like avowed identity. I sat at the desk and typed into my notebook a draft announcement, beginning with the next phase of our campaign launches tomorrow. Not out of malice, but out of respect for erased truth. I opened a folder titled Whistleblower Audio and clicked through 8 anonymous testimonies. Each voice recounted ideas, taken credits, denied lines from their draft, repurposed for Delilah's show. I matched each voice to documents Eric had found, filing both securely. In another folder labeled Sponsorship Log, I reviewed spreadsheets detailing funds pulled quietly after internal complaints. I leaned forward, reviewing names and dates, cross-referencing logos of companies and networks. I closed my eyes briefly and felt oxygen rush back. I was no longer the invisible daughter. I was the archivist of truth. I closed the laptop lid softly and placed my palm on the jacket again. Inside the main house, I saw staff pause when my figure passed. Some avoided eye contact, others offered polite acknowledgement. I did not need their approval. I recognized a shift in the estate's atmosphere. Something had stirred beneath the surface, changing silent normalcy. I stepped into the foyer and tracked messages on my phone. Email threads marked lead review, media strategy, legal approval. Press release file had a timestamp. Reports of coverage, inquiries, names of journalists. I breathed in slowly. Quiet had begun to move mountains. My throat tightened with anticipation, but also with clarity. I sat in silence under the lamp and exhaled deeply. Tomorrow, I would speak again, not as the invisible sister, but as the voice of restoration. Eki Grace's message came in first thing, the email subject, urgent Blooming Hearts audit concerns. I rode the elevator down to the carriage house media room and found her whiter-coated coffee steaming in her hand. She said quietly that our initial financial review exposed inconsistencies in Blooming Hearts, Delilah's charity. Disbursements didn't match donations, board minutes were missing. Some grants were redirected to shell entities. She added that the charity's filings had unusual expense patterns inconsistent with nonprofit benchmarks. The picture looked like misappropriation rather than bookkeeping error. Nathan leaned in at the table. He and I had stayed up late reviewing documents. He said we should simulate a fundraiser under that banner to draw out behavior, and I agreed. Grace quickly began drafting the framework while I pulled up the names of sponsors and donors. By midday, we had a plan, a live stream event under the pretext of supporting Blooming Hearts with guests Nathan, Grace, and me posing as hosts. We would send a formal invitation to Delilah listing her as a guest speaker and drop subtle details she could correct or reveal. I felt a knot in my stomach, but a purpose too. This was not entrapment so much as invitation. We wanted information, not performance. We set cameras discreetly, recorded high quality. I coordinated with Eric about tracking IP addresses and timestamps. We had observers ready to log appropriate reactions while Grace monitored comments for real-time reactions. On the evening of the live stream, we wore simple outfits seated behind a table with a Blooming Hearts banner. I opened with a composed greeting introducing our anonymous beneficiaries and thanking supporters. Then I invited the omitted narrative saying, "Let's talk about transparency." Nathan piped in referencing initial complaints from staff and anomalies in tax reports. I asked Delilah to weigh in. She appeared on screen with a practiced smile and greeted us. Her voice was smooth, her tone, what viewers expected. The conversation drifted toward budgets. She spoke of overhead staffing, community efforts. Then she misstated a key figure, 16.5% overhead, when internal documents had shown less than 8%. The number hung in the air. I felt a jolt. She paused. Guests awaited. She stumbled over phrase, corrected herself, but too late. The figure was wrong. The volunteers on chat asked for receipts. I let silence fill the space. After 15 minutes, we cut the live stream. Nathan said that was enough. Grace loaded the clip, time-stamped the flawed number, and sent it with supporting documents to the IRS fraud tip line. We sent a note summarizing discrepancies in filings. Within hours, reporters began sharing blind tips citing records. Social media lit up. Delilah posted again the following morning. She blamed the accounting team, said she had relied on staff figures, called seeing wrong numbers dismaying. She expressed confidence that audits would clear her. It sounded rehearsed and weak. Her publicist distributed a statement of denial, not about misconduct, but about sloppy internal reporting. Grace entered my room again. She said we had moved from speculation to scrutiny. Complaints from local press noted a regulatory review was pending. She said we should let the process move. Eric updated the spreadsheet, donor names, fund disbursements, discrepancies. I reviewed hours of data. I felt the pattern match: money routed, oddly, oversight absent, pride replaced by scandal. Eric informed Grace and me that at least 2 former board members had submitted affidavits complaining of restricted access to financial records, canceled meetings, and anonymous instructions to hide rubber stamp accounting. They agreed to speak under confidentiality agreements. Grace filed witness statements. She passed them to me via encrypted folder labeled Phase 2 calibration. I sat on the couch in media room watching the sunset through a window. I recalled how I once thought silence protected me. Now silence was a weapon in structure. I sipped water and considered what came next. Delilah still held public power, but cracks appeared. Each misstep she made widened them. I returned the jacket Alexander lent. It felt heavy with integrity now. I folded it neatly and set it on a chair. I sent a note to Nathan with a timeline of sponsor activity. His message read, "Thank you for giving me back narrative." I responded quietly that he earned it. Inside the estate, I heard whispers from staff as I walked by. Some paused in corridors. I did not seek their approval. It felt as though the quiet truth I stirred would echo even if I stayed silent. I checked media trackers showing rising impressions of silent voices, clip and event replays. I felt steadier than before. That night, I lay in bed in my rented room. I wrote in the journal a single line: "This was the moment lifting masks began." I exhaled deeply. Eventually, judgment would come. But for now, fact had broken cover. Robert's message came just after dawn, requesting a meeting in the family sitting room, a sign I'd been waiting for without intending to face it. Clearing the sleep from my mind, I slipped the journal into my bag and walked the hushed corridors that once felt suffocating now felt like a threshold marking irrevocable changes. When I arrived, Robert stood beside the mantelpiece, hands tense inside each other, shoulders slumped under the weight of unspoken truths. He did not invite me to sit. I took the seat opposite Journal, still inside my bag, and waited. He spoke slowly, hesitantly, as though his words were fragile objects he feared might shatter in his hands. He confessed that Delilah was always his preferred daughter, compliant, predictable, easy to present to the world as the perfect face of the Whitmore legacy. He said, was different, probing, irreverent, difficult to contain or direct. There was discomfort in my questions, discomfort in my refusal to be silent. He mourned the ease he once felt in silence, the unity it preserved, and how that unity had come at the cost of truth. His voice cracked when he admitted he had once been proud of me until I became inconvenient. In that moment, the unsaid sank into the room between us. I remained silent. I let the quiet absorb his regret. When I later received Grace's message, the news landed like cold water. Judith had collapsed at home, diagnosed with acute anxiety and dehydration triggered by relentless media pressure. Robert called again, voice small and frail, offering apology, but I did not feel grief. Instead, a still crystalline resolve took root. This must end. By midday, I found myself back in the media room with the dossier Grace had assembled under the label Family Accountability. Inside were pitch outlines from 2017 IRS filings showing financial anomalies in Blooming Hearts, internal memos from staff whose ideas were erased or credited to others, sponsorship withdrawal records, and pending audit alerts. I opened a fresh email addressed to every sponsor, network, affiliate, foundation, partner, and investor tied to the Morning Bloom and the charity. I laid out allegations of plagiarism, financial irregularities, forced internal silences, and withheld whistleblowing. I attached supporting PDFs, spreadsheets, email threads, documents redacted to protect sources, and issued a 72-hour deadline for response before wider disclosure. With calm precision, I pressed send. It felt less like accusation, more like accountability. Grace tracked open rates in real time. Eric monitored responses. Within hours, 2 major sponsors notified us they initiated internal audits, a broadcasting affiliate paused contract renegotiations, and the Morning Bloom's next live episode was cancelled pending review. The structure that upheld Delilah's empire began unraveling quietly, precisely. I felt sober satisfaction. This was not about spectacle, it was about dismantling structure built on lies. Robert never spoke to me again. His silence echoed through grand hallways and ornate sitting rooms, repen interiors that once served as backdrops to my erasure. In that silence, I recognized complicity, not neutrality. I quietly accepted that realization as part of the reckoning. That evening, I methodically packed my suitcase. I folded the jacket Alexander had lent me and placed it inside. It no longer felt like borrowed armor, it felt earned. Under the soft glow of the bedside lamp, I reopened my journal. I wrote, "This chapter ends when truth confronts power." I closed the book gently and set it beside my laptop, pen paused mid-ink. Later, I wandered the foyer in the fading light. Staff whispered in corners or paused mid-A ask when I passed. Some offered strained, cautious nods, others averted their eyes. I did not meet their gaze. Affirmation held no weight. I felt the subtle shift in the estate's atmosphere, an undercurrent of tension as compliance gave way to awareness. Back in my room, I placed the journal and laptop neatly and lay on my bed watching shadows drift across the ceiling in slow motion. Outside, families prepared dinner with no idea of what was unraveling within these walls. Within me, clarity glowed steadily like embers under cold ash. I inhaled deeply, exhaled slowly. Fiction was fading. Fact had broken cover. Quiet had become consequence. I turned off the lamp and lay in darkness, not empty, but full of purpose. I knew the next chapter awaited, and when it came, I would speak again, not with fury, but with restoration in mind. The morning light seeped gently through the curtains, stirring the quiet room where I lay awake before the sun had fully risen. I slid the journal carefully into my bag, feeling the weight of those final words. This was the moment. Lifting masks began like a tether, anchoring me to a new path. The air was thick with anticipation and purpose as I made my way through the silent halls of the estate, every step measured and deliberate. Each echo off the polished floors carried the weight of everything left unsaid, every shadow cast by past silences and hidden truths. I reached the media room where Grace stood calm before a bank of screens. On every monitor, Delilah appeared poised at the center of a carefully crafted stage bathed in soft light surrounded by microphones and cameras. The press conference was underway, and the stakes had never felt higher. Delilah's voice was smooth, her words calculated. She addressed the allegations of scholarship fraud with a cool detachment that masked the sharpness beneath. Without naming me, she painted a picture of a fabricated narrative, a story spun out of ambition disguised as victimhood. There are those who seek to rewrite their history, she said, to earn sympathy through falsehood. Flashbulbs exploded around her as the crowd hung on her every word. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras captured every fleeting expression. I sat silently watching the spectacle unfold. Grace slid a USB drive across the table to me. I opened it carefully, revealing a trove of certified documents from Westlake University, official transcripts, scholarship, award, letters, enrollment confirmations, all bearing official seals and notarizations. Grace opened a scanned copy on the monitor, zooming in on the meticulous details, the precise signatures and embossed stamps that made the truth indisputable. I nodded silently. Facts laid bare. Delilah continued, recasting herself as the victim of a manufactured scandal, her voice laced with a subtle edge of righteous indignation. She spoke of betrayal, of ambition cloaked in tragedy, and how some would exploit personal history for their gain. The audience applauded dutifully, cameras zoomed in on her confident smile, and the room seemed to momentarily suspend reality in her favor. Minutes later, Grace clicked a button, and the next phase of our plan was set in motion. Emails leaked to trusted journalists exposed the inner workings of Delilah's production team. Pitch documents authored by junior staff vanished without credit. Entire scripts were lifted wholesale and attributed to Delilah. Financial records from Blooming Hearts Foundation revealed a labyrinth of irregularities, phantom events billed and reimbursed payments funneled to shell companies' inflated budgets, masking personal expenses. Confidential affidavits from former employees told of coercion, and silence of voices muffled beneath layers of intimidation. Grace sent the dossier to major news outlets, regulatory bodies, and state charity commissions with clinical precision. Delilah's public relations team responded swiftly with a well-rehearsed narrative. The irregularities were the product of administrative errors and chaotic restructuring, not intentional misconduct. Within minutes, Grace countered with cross-referenced audit trails, sponsorship timelines, and correspondence tying discrepancies directly to Delilah's decisions. The shift in the story was palpable. A foundation built on falsehoods began to crack. At that moment, my phone buzzed. Nathan's message appeared. You did what no one dared. I stared at the ceiling, the weight of those words settling over me. I didn't reply. Some silences speak louder than words. By midday, the scandal had exploded across media platforms worldwide. Regulatory agencies announced formal investigations, sponsors publicly withdrew their endorsements. The network suspended the Morning Bloom indefinitely, citing ongoing audits. Blooming Hearts bank accounts were frozen. Delilah faced subpoenas and mounting legal scrutiny. The empire she built was beginning to crumble. Requests for interviews flooded Grace's inbox. Each was met with a polite but firm refusal. She replied that I would not be the face of this campaign. The focus was on the evidence, not the spectacle. When pressed, Grace reiterated the story belonged to facts, not personalities. That evening, I wandered through the estate's foyer, now muted and heavy with unspoken truths. The walls bore portraits of family gatherings, long past, smiles frozen in time yet now feeling hollow. Staff moved with tentative awareness, some nodding cautiously, others averting their eyes. I offered no acknowledgement, feeling neither victory nor bitterness, only the gravity of change. In my room, I placed the USB drive beside my journal and sat under the soft glow of the desk lamp. Opening the notebook, I penned, "Truth demands consequence. Restoration begins when silence shatters." I closed it gently and set the pen beside my laptop. Later, I stepped onto the balcony and gazed over Charlotte's skyline as twilight bled into night. The estate lay quiet behind me, charged with an almost electric tension. I inhaled deeply, letting the cool air steady my racing thoughts. Exhaling slowly, I embraced a clarity that steadied me. That night, I packed quietly. The jacket Alexander had lent me lay folded beside my journal and laptop. It no longer felt borrowed or symbolic, it felt earned. I turned off the lamp, placed my phone face down, and lay in bed. In the darkness, I found neither emptiness nor fear but a deep, unshakable presence. This campaign had evolved beyond accusation or spectacle. It had become the architecture of accountability. Lies unraveled, truths endured. Quiet had transformed into resonance. I closed my eyes knowing that tomorrow I would rise again, not fueled by anger but grounded in restoration and clarity. The early morning sun filtered gently through the half-open blinds, painting golden patterns across the quiet room. Sleep had been brief but restful, my thoughts calm and ordered, free from the turmoil that had marked so many sleepless nights before. I dressed slowly, methodically, taking time to savor each movement, the buttoning of my jacket, the packing of my bag, as if each action solidified my resolve and clarity. Stepping outside, I felt the cool breeze brush against my skin, invigorating rather than chilling. The Whitmore mansion stood silently behind me, no longer imposing or filled with shadows, but merely a relic of a chapter I had firmly closed. It was a backdrop now, not a prison, a reminder, not a burden. Alexander stood quietly beside his car at the end of the driveway, the picture of calm dignity. His expression softened slightly when he saw me, a subtle acknowledgement that said more than any words could. Over the past few weeks, he'd become a steady presence, a rare ally who understood strength without spectacle. He opened the car door, his eyes conveying quiet respect and unwavering support. We drove silently through the streets of Charlotte, the city awakening slowly around us, vendors setting up for the day, joggers moving steadily along sidewalks, the soft glow of sunlight illuminating a skyline that had once been filled with parade to press of only painful memories. Alexander finally broke the silence, his voice measured and gentle. "There's a position opening at an independent media firm in New York," he said, eyes fixed thoughtfully ahead. "Complete editorial freedom, no interference, no compromises. A chance to tell stories that really matter, stories no one else wants to touch." For a brief moment, his words stirred something within me, an old yearning for validation, a desire to reclaim my voice publicly, boldly. But as the city passed by outside the window, I shook my head slightly, the certainty settling deeply inside me. "I appreciate that," I replied quietly, "but I don't need an audience anymore, not now." Alexander nodded slowly, understanding implicit in his quiet demeanor. "When you're ready," he said softly, "the offer remains." At Charlotte Douglas International Airport, we exchanged quiet farewells. Alexander's eyes held a subtle warmth, his handshake firm, conveying respect without expectation. Stepping into the busy terminal, I felt strangely calm amid the chaos of travelers rushing toward destinations. It was as if I'd finally stepped fully into myself, no longer defined by others' opinions, no longer carrying their judgments as my own. Sitting near the gate, I pulled my phone from my bag, thumbing through notifications and messages, finding nothing. No missed calls from my mother, no texts from Delilah, just silence. Yet this silence felt different now. It was peaceful, a sign of finality and acceptance rather than abandonment or loss. I didn't need apologies, nor did I seek validation from those who'd once defined my existence. That chapter had closed with an unspoken finality. The airplane ascended smoothly, lifting me effortlessly above the streets and rooftops of Charlotte. Below, the city shrank into tiny patterns, a distant mosaic etched with pain, lessons learned, and battles quietly won. Ahead stretched the boundless expanse of open sky, endless and full of promise, awaiting whatever I chose to make of it. As I gazed out the window, I thought about the silence I'd lived within for so long, the nights I felt invisible, moments when my voice felt lost beneath others' noise. But now the silence was not a void. It was powerful, a potent presence I could shape at will. It carried strength, dignity, and intention. Silence, I realized, was not merely absence. It could shout louder than words when wielded deliberately. If you've ever felt silenced, unheard, or invisible, please remember this silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's a quiet strength that can dismantle even the loudest lies. If Ava's story has resonated deeply with you, if you see yourself reflected in her quiet strength and steady resolve, I encourage you to like this video. Subscribe to our channel and follow for more stories like hers. Stories that delve deeper, strike colder, and speak truths that are sometimes harsher but always real, always waiting patiently to be revealed. Thank you for joining us. Until we meet again to unravel another tale of reckoning, resilience, and revenge.